We are approaching one of the biggest decisions this country will face in our lifetimes.
In late June, British voters will decide whether they want the UK to remain a part of the European Union or whether they want the UK to leave. The consequences of Brexit would potentially be enormous and would go well beyond its effects on the British economy or on the European economy. It is therefore time to ask the question, what if the UK left the European Union? So let's assume British voters on the 23rd of June decide to leave the EU. What are the options for the United Kingdom? First, if the UK wants to retain its access to the European single market, it could become a member of the European Economic Area, like Norway or Liechtenstein or Iceland. By doing that, the UK would still have to apply a bulk of European legislation. If you look at the example of Norway, you'll see that Norway still applies EU legislation, has to contribute into the common European budget, and has absolutely no say over the content of the European legislation it has to apply in order to comply with the rules of the single market. And many Norwegians, therefore, argue that by staying outside of the EU, the sovereignty of their country has been weakened, not strengthened. Now, the other option for the UK would be to negotiate a series of bilateral agreements with the EU guaranteeing its access to the single market. But that would not solve the fundamental issue either. The EU is the world's largest economy, and it is fairly obvious that it is therefore in a better negotiating position vis-à-vis third countries than the UK would be outside of the EU. Furthermore, the UK would still be required to follow a large part of the European legislation, namely that part that pertains to the single market. The British could also decide not to be part of the single market. It could decide to negotiate a trade agreement with the EU that would give them some form of access to the single market, maybe be part of a customs union with the EU without being part of the single market. That comes at a cost. Most customs agreements, even the agreement that's being negotiated between Canada and the EU, do not cover services, and services are an important and growing part of the British economy, especially in the area of finance. The City of London is one of the most important financial capitals in the world. Its appeal to large banks, hedge funds, venture capital firms stems from the fact that it serves as a gateway for operations throughout the European Union. A single set of financial regulatory rules applies throughout the EU, and if the UK were to leave, it's unclear that the City of London would still have that same appeal if the UK decided to extricate itself from European financial regulation. So therefore, many of these businesses, many of these banks would probably find it much more interesting to operate from, say, Frankfurt than from London. The critics of the EU sometimes contrast the European Union with a Europe of sovereign democratic nation states that they want to return to. And obviously we could go back to a Europe of sovereign nation states, but we should realize that Europe, as it is described by Eurosceptics, is a completely ahistorical fantasy. Europe of sovereign nation states of the end of 19th century or early 20th century was a Europe of rising protectionism, economic nationalism, authoritarian regimes, and ultimately of recurrent conflicts. The regime in the Kremlin has also been actively supporting nationalist and Eurosceptic and anti-establishment movements across Europe. The more Mr. Putin undermines European unity, the more he weakens European resolve to confront Russia's expansionism in Eastern Europe, the more Vladimir Putin has to gain. Therefore, it's not a surprise that on all the Kremlin-connected propaganda networks, including Sputnik or Russia Today, we've been hearing praises of Brexit for months and months, trying to dismantle the EU, which has been historically the most successful attempt to bring peace and economic openness to the European continent, would likely jeopardize many of the achievements that we've seen and that we are now taking for granted in Europe. Nobody's arguing that the UK's exit from the EU in and by itself would be a geopolitical catastrophe. We've seen many friendly, amicable divorces of political unions in the past. One example comes from my own home country, Czechoslovakia, that disintegrated in 1992 on very friendly terms, keeping many of the existing political, economic, social and cultural ties intact. However, at the time when Western unity comes under unprecedented stress, Brexit would give ammunition to the enemies of free societies across Europe and beyond. It would strengthen Vladimir Putin, it would strengthen nationalist movements, and could lead to a whole range of unpleasant, unintended consequences going way beyond its immediate impact on the British or European economy. I have more to say about Brexit, about the EU, and about European reform in my forthcoming book, Towards an Imperfect Union, which is being published with Roman and Littlefield in May. But what are your thoughts on Brexit? Please do let us know in the comments section. Also, let us know if you'd like us to cover any specific topics in AI's What If series.